Hmm. Okay, there we go. Now the recording has started. So this is the March 17th, 2020 Crossplane community meeting. And we are headed towards our next release of 0.9 right now. The tentative schedule that we are proposing would be a feature freeze on at the end of day, Monday, March 23rd. And then we will be releasing on the morning of March 25th, which is a Wednesday. With the feature freeze there, we want to have all features into master so that it could be integration tested and vetted and find any issues to be able to clean those up. But if there are any important things that are still coming in on the 24th, we can do a triage to assess the importance of them and the risk of introducing them as well, and make decisions about what would be included for the release. But we'll be targeting a feature freeze on Monday the 23rd. That is 6 days from now. So next Monday, right after the weekend here, is when we'll be freezing. Let's bring up the roadmap real quick. So I think in the 0.9 roadmap here, like things like the template stacks, we've got those pretty much on lockdown there. I think the only thing that's still left is like code coverage. I was just talking to Moffic about that. And there's good coverage for the templating controller, which is the reusable logic to do template rendering. So that's in a good shape. And then Moffic's going to take another pass through like Stack Manager integration to see if there's any big testing gaps there. But all in all, Daniel Susskind and Moffic did a fantastic job of getting all that functionality for template stacks together and fleshed out and polished as well. So they seem to be working really well in all of our usage of them with the minimal GCP and AWS stacks, and the WordPress application is template now too. So everything seems to be going really well there. That's going to be in this milestone, and things are good. We already updated the GitHub org from Crossplane.io to Crossplane, so you can just remove Crossplane.io from your collective memory and never think about it again. Stuff, we have a little update on that in a bit, so we can focus on that, but that's going well as well also, and that'll be included in 0.9 milestone. We have some basic support for using private repositories with image pool secrets that has been included. And in our release process, I think there's a couple things that we might want to follow up on there still to improve our documentation and some of our approach there, but not massive things. So I think, that's most of the stuff for 0.9. I think the big outstanding things are, I think, probably around finishing up our planned support for OHM here. Okay, so I think Moffic added some notes here to the agenda. Let me go ahead and approve those. All right, so we can move on to the community topic section here. So first note real quick is that the Crossplane.io site has been updated. So the messaging on here and the focus of explaining the value of Crossplane and benefits to users and what it does has been scrubbed and cleaned up and made a lot more streamlined and understandable. So Crossplane, you manage your applications and infrastructure the Kubernetes way. I like that messaging, and the whole site's been updated here with that type of explanation and value for Crossplane. So feel free to take a look at that. TBS episodes. We had the latest TBS episode was last week on Thursday. I thought it was a really good episode. Dan, do you want to give us a little some of the high level highlights there for the LinkerD episode?
Sure. So Thomas Rampelberg from LinkerD joined us, and he's around the Kubernetes community and has been working on LinkerD for I think about 2 years now. Right now, and probably the most interesting part of the episode, he's working on their multi-cluster approach. So they're basically developing something called Service Mirror, where their strategy for networking across different clusters and different regions and that sort of thing is to basically create gateways and mirror all services. So every service has a representation in every cluster, and then they basically proxy that to the other clusters. So he had some really cool insight on that. One of the best parts of the episode for sure was when we talked about a blog post where he was talking about architecting for multi-cluster Kubernetes. And we talked a little bit about a specific section that was talking about having a single control plane, where it was basically advocating for not having a single control plane. And, that seems in conflict, I guess, with some of Crossplane's messaging. But throughout our conversation, we really actually agreed that the Crossplane handling the movement of data between clusters, so configuration data, is actually the right model. So he referred to it as a hierarchical control plane, which I thought was a great term for it. And I think everybody left kind of excited about the possibility of using something like LinkerD for a data plane with Crossplane kind of orchestrating the components of that. So a lot of cool stuff happening there. Both he and the Buoyant CTO, who is one of the founders of LinkerD, are excited to kind of circle back and work on some collaboration with Crossplane. So it was overall a good episode, and the linked show notes there have the guide for deploying LinkerD into remote clusters using Crossplane. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
Yeah, awesome, Dan. Yeah, that was a great episode. And that was something that it took me a little bit of time to wrap my head around too, was that concept of like a hierarchical control plane, and, his original messaging around like a unified or a, single control plane being a bad idea. And that's one of the little observations that I had is that what's interesting is that, and I've seen this in Rook before too, where like Rook is like an orchestration control plane layer for storage, and like data plane, you can turn the operators off, like your Rook operators off, you can turn Crossplane's controllers off, and the functionality that they set up and managed to configured is still working. They still have like a bit of a control plane to run the databases, the caches, and the buckets, and all those things that you set up. So they're kind of an independent. This distinction between like the control plane and then control planes, like at a lower level for the services that are running. So it's kind of like this hierarchy between like Crossplane kind of overlooking and oversight for everything and managing it, and then individual control planes in each cluster to continue running services. And so it's not like a single point of failure at all, actually. I thought that was really interesting to bring that up. I hadn't thought about that before. Did you have any insight into what the next episode might be?
As with last week, yes, but I'm not going to say it yet, just in case that the plans fall through. We actually had a different plan for the LinkerD episode and ended up kind of getting that together last minute, which turned out really great. Hopefully that doesn't happen this week, but I'll hold on to it till beginning of next week.
Fair enough. One of these community meetings, I'll get you to speak about the plans ahead of time. That's okay. All right. So then some open application model OHM updates. So application configuration controller, one of the top level entities in the OHM spec. And Nick has merged that into core Crossplane's master branch. So you could take an application configuration and then render that, reconcile that into a number of like workloads and traits and things like that. So that's available. And then there's the next layer of processing in the OHM spec, abstraction to concrete types there. Dan has been working on an add-on that will take those workloads and abstractions from OHM and convert them into Kubernetes applications and concrete types that can actually run those resources and services, et cetera, in remote clusters. And there's also some work that's ongoing for doing that for local cluster as well. So there's a lot of shared commonality between these implementations. But at the end of the day, in the 0.9 release, you would be able to take a top level OHM application configuration and get it to reconcile and render down to running components for actually having services and apps and everything up and running and being functional. So that's super exciting to have all that stuff included in 0.9. Moffat, do you want to talk a little bit about the resource tagging that you added to the agenda?
Yeah, so this feature, like we were thinking implementing it, like and then Ramiro, the guy that Daniel had made a TBS episode. He opened an issue about like this, like, hey, I want to be able to filter down my resources like with provider, class, and all that stuff. So we have accelerated the effort, and now it landed on Crossplane runtime, and I'm implementing it over the providers. So this has been especially frustrating for me. For example, when I lose my Minikube or like Kindi cluster for some reason, all VPCs are leaked in AWS. But this way I can just go into like VPs, because like we can't really name the VPCs, they have their own IDs. So you can go ahead in the AWS console and like search for your namespace or maybe resource name or provider name even. And then you can get like everything, and like you can see how much they cost you and stuff. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so this is implemented in the Crossplane runtime. So you'd is there further integration work for each like provider or stack or whatever to like incorporate that, or does it like come for free with the because it's implemented in the Crossplane runtime?
There is some work to do. Like right now it's implemented by Cloud SQL in GCP.
Oh, it's not a per resource thing?
Yeah, unfortunately, because they all have different tagging mechanisms in their SDK.
Oh, that's nice.
So it's implemented for Cloud SQL, and I have a PR open for RDS, replication group, and VPC of AWS. It's pretty trivial to implement it though.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, it's just like a few things like the integration effort you added to it, because like the runtime, Crossplane runtime does all the like core reconciliation, reusable logic.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, we get the tags that we need from runtime and put it on the resource.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks for that contribution, Mafik. I appreciate it.
Are the as far as like providers implementing this, as far as they're concerned, are the tags supported like slices of strings, or are they all more maps, key value maps?
They're key value maps in most of the cases. We have right now like namespace if it exists, provider and class. So basically you would say, hey, like which cluster, like EKS cluster class that I have in my Crossplane, like how many EKS clusters are provisioned via this class and stuff on the AWS console. So it's mapped.
Cool. Awesome, Mafik. And there's something else I thought about adding to the agenda here is the terminology changes recently. We had changed some of the repositories to reflect some easier terminology thinking. Phil, would you be able to talk through some of the thinking around, changing from calling everything a stack to calling them providers and stacks and applications?
Yeah, sure. So, one thing that we've been, kind of referring to stacks as like infrastructure stacks or application stacks. And then, we recently have created, kind of these environmental config stacks that kind of model more of the configuration state for an environment and allow you to templatize that with our kind of minimal GCP that provides like, Kubernetes and data services in the cloud. You can just say like, this is the stack that I'm using, and here's my, curated best practices. And when you think about, like the term stack, and when you say like, oh yeah, like what stack are you using? It's typically like this specific set of, technologies that are working together that your apps run on. And so that's kind of your stack, your tech stack. And so we'd also started calling our infrastructure stacks like cloud provider stacks, or just, providers. And then they have one of the key resources in them, which is the provider resource itself. And so, and then people are pretty familiar with applications. And so we're just kind of moving to kind of like a more refined set of terminology, where we have providers, which basically model out the providers that we have today. So anything that has like a provider resource in it is basically called a provider, and that can either be like a cloud provider or a smaller managed service provider. So like a cloud provider, like GCP or Azure or AWS, Alibaba, et cetera, have lots of cloud services that are available or that are made available in Crossplane through the Kubernetes API. So you can kind of provision them, from within Kubernetes. And so those are basically, providers. And then you also have, like standalone managed service providers like, Mongo or Confluence, right? And they have like a single service, and those are basically composables that you can pick the right providers, and you can have more than one provider installed into your Crossplane instance. So then you say, well, I have applications, and applications, I want to bundle those up, and I'm doing deployments today and services and my ingress definitions, but then I want to consume those cloud services. By the way, those cloud services can also be on-prem, right? So if you're using like VMware or other on-prem services, Crossplane can also have those be providers. And so the app teams come in and they're like, okay, great, I want to deploy onto GCP, but there's not a curated set of services like in a catalog that a ops or an infrastructure team might want to create. And so they can go and then create a stack that represents these ready to run off the shelf stacks that you can just install into Crossplane that basically populate a catalog of available services that can be provisioned through the Kubernetes API with all of the best practice configs and the security and so forth. And so then app teams can then just go and consume that infrastructure. They're automatically compliant with the best practices that the infra and ops teams have put together for that. They can self-service, and that works great. So basically the three things are providers, stacks, and applications. So yeah.
Cool, Phil. Thank you for updating us on that there. And I think there might be, so all the provider repos have been updated to the naming change there. I think there maybe are some more outstanding ones, like maybe the WordPress example there needs to be renamed to application, but the major cloud provider repositories have been updated now.
Yep. And we have some docs updates that are coming to kind of roll that out. So I think Dan's taken point on that, but yep.
Awesome.
You just described it as a cloud provider stack. So does that mean that the stack word can still hide out?
No, that's just my lapse of judgment. So yeah.
Yeah, we have to do a little muscle memory
rejiggering
rejiggering here. Yeah.
I will say.
And actually, what I was saying is, so you have providers, 1, 2 stacks, 3 applications. So just those 3 things. But good catch.
I will say it is a little bit hard to say, like cloud providers. Yeah, like a cloud provider's provider kind of thing. But I wonder if we can, this is a discussion for another time, but I'll bring it up now anyway. I wonder if the term cloud provider could be adapted to a more general term. Because like, for instance, our GitHub stack, which is brand new, like you might not think of that as a cloud provider, but there's a provider for it. And it would also remove that kind of like stuttering of the name of cloud provider. Anyway, carry on.
Carry on. Cool. All right, so let's move ahead to the PRs section. And the first one that I added here was that we got a pull request from Artur, I think just last night, about a reusable dev container to be able to have a predictable, consistent environment to do development work on Crossplane, which seems like a cool idea. But I didn't quite, I'm not quite sure how best this would be utilized. Like, what is the experience for it in terms of developers like actually doing work? Like, do you open up the container like interactively and do, like run make inside the container? Or I'm not sure what the experience is. And then also the maintainability of it, because it's like, doing specific like packages, doing gets on like specific packages. Like, do we need to update that like every time we have a new import? Or it seems like it might be a little fragile perhaps in terms of the maintenance of it over time. So I wanted to open the floor up to anybody who might have experience with one of these types of dev containers here, and about any recommendations on how useful this will be broadly, or if there's some major feedback on ways to improve it.
I was thinking I was talking to Artur about this the other day, and he was wanting to add it just to make his local dev experience better, which one of the things we've run into with people a few times is having the wrong Go version, basically. And sometimes it's, well, it's, I guess, all the time, not super straightforward to switch between Go versions on your local machine, especially if you're a new contributor or something like that. So I think it's useful in that regard. I wonder if we could incorporate maybe not even this collaboration sort of thing with VS Code, but at least the actual container manifest into the build submodule to keep it more lockstep with that, because we don't want developers, we don't want them to get out of sync and then someone developing locally with something that's not going to build. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's kind of one of my, like, going down the line of thinking that I had of, like, you know, the maintenance of this thing. Like, do you have to keep updating it, or, you know, you're going to run into issues where, like, it isn't in agreement with, you know, other dependencies that flow in. And then this is interesting too, like bringing in a spanner dependency here. Where did that even come from? To, like, why does core crossplane now need to depend on spanner?
Yeah, I think he forgot it because, like, he doesn't edit any Go files. So Go mod and Go sum shouldn't change at all.
Yeah.
It looks like an indirect dependency of that Go SQL, which is also at the bottom, which I don't know why that's.
Yeah. Yeah, go up the chain. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like maybe some discussion to have on the PR here. But like, because, you know, I personally I haven't run into issues or needed to do this, and I don't understand how it's used, but that does not mean that the community at large wouldn't benefit from it. So, you know, just because old dog over here doesn't want to learn new tricks doesn't mean that we shouldn't introduce this for, you know, people that are hip and with it, let's say. Cool. All right, we'll leave some feedback on that one. And also, it's awesome that Artur is, you know, jumping in and contributing and adding new stuff that, you know, could be beneficial to the community. So, you know, thank you very much to Artur. He's not on the call, but YouTube shout out. Okay, and then Dan, you brought this one up here, 1341.
Yeah, not too much to discuss here. Just wanted to make people aware of it. We've actually, for quite some time, been creating remote resources successfully, but not actually updating them when changes are made to the either Kubernetes application or directly to the Kubernetes application resource template. And the issue for that is that we were basically taking the change, you know, in the reconcile, getting the objects that's being reconciled, and then checking the remote status of that object, and then applying the patch with the remote status of the object, which is obviously a no-op every time because you're getting the status and then just applying it back to it. So as part of that, this updates it to use the actual, you know, desired template now instead to perform the patch. It also starts to move towards using some more of the Crossplane runtime stuff. These controllers are pretty old, and there's a lot of new standards, which not all are implemented here. But for instance, we're kind of making slow incremental improvement on these as things come up. So here we move to using raw extension, which is kind of preferable over having the unstructured templates. And the reason for that is that it makes it harder to basically accidentally modify the object itself, because you're passing around bytes that have to then be marshaled into an unstructured object, or if you know the object type, into that struct itself. So that's kind of a pattern that we're trying to update things to. There's not actually too many places where this even happens, but it does update it to follow that pattern. We've also done things like adding some better logging here. And in the future, this will also be improved with eventing and that sort of thing. So it's kind of making some slow improvements on Kubernetes applications and Kubernetes application resources, as they've kind of been dormant for a bit.
One question, Daniel, does this solve the problem that you had with the patching the array?
So no, it doesn't. There's actually, which I guess I could have put on here as well, a separate PR on Crossplane runtime that was merged that allows you to pass arguments to the apply function, which does the merge patch. So for context, the issue that Movafic is referencing here is that with the OAM work, we are basically rendering Kubernetes applications when we want the output of a OAM workload to be scheduled remotely. We get the translation of it and basically package up in a Kubernetes application so it can be scheduled. The issue with that is that when you do a merge patch, arrays or array elements get overwritten, which you can imagine why that would be the case, because you don't know if it should update an element or replace it. If it's like a struct in place, you know, what's the criteria for saying this is similar enough that I just want to change this one field versus replace the whole thing. So that's normally not an issue when we're updating resources because we'd want it to have that behavior. But if we have something like a deployment, which in the spec has things like selectors, pod spec template, it has replicas, which is specifically the field we were interested in this case, which are not array values, right? So we want to either remove those or keep them if they're existing and we're not passing a nil value to it. So what was happening is because we are modifying the Kubernetes application that has the deployment nested as an array element, it was actually overriding that full element. So something like a replica, which normally wouldn't be overwritten when you patch a deployment itself, was getting overwritten because it was replacing the whole deployment as an array element in the Kubernetes application. So basically what we're doing instead now is passing a function to the patch apply functionality we have in Crossplane runtime that before it patches them, it essentially moves them into separate objects and patches them individually and then puts them back into the Kubernetes application and then does the patch with that. So we preserve all those fields. So not like the best thing there, but I think the workaround we have is actually probably as good as it's going to get unless if we move to doing server-side apply sometime in the future.
That sounds somewhat reasonable, at least to me. Okay, cool. So that was all the outstanding PRs that we wanted to bring up for discussion here. And that is the end of the agenda items that were on here. Did anybody have any items that they wanted to add to the agenda or bring up now? And if not, then we can go ahead and adjourn for the week. Alrighty. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we will see you all online. Thank you.
That's good. Happy Tuesday.
Yeah.